All she wanted was a spool of white thread. But when she walked into that store, the banker's wife humiliated her in front of the whole town, mocking her calloused hands, then dropping a bomb that shattered her world. The bank was foreclosing on her family's orchard. Her father had died 8 months ago, with a foreclosure letter still in his hand and a pen still in his grip. Now she's running 40 acres alone, and someone just poisoned her only draft horse. Then they poured kerosene around her storehouse. Then they planted stolen cattle equipment on her land to frame her for a hanging crime. And the only man who stepped forward to help her? He's hiding a secret that could destroy her worse than anything the banker ever did. Because 15 years ago, he drew the map that marked her family's orchard with one word circled in red ink: vulnerable. He helped build the trap that killed her father, and now he's falling in love with the daughter. What she doesn't know yet is that a hired killer is already watching from the tree line, and he makes no sound when he moves. Welcome to Wild West Stories, where the rugged frontier reveals the raw truth about love born from hardship, the unshakable bond between sisters, and the quiet, stubborn dignity of people who refuse to be broken no matter what the world throws at them. This story teaches us that real atonement doesn't happen in the dark. It happens in the open, where it cost you something. And that dignity isn't something anyone can give you or take away. It's something you carry through the fire with your own 2 hands. If that opening gave you chills, hit like right now and drop a comment. Do you think a man can ever truly make up for the damage he's done? Share this with someone who knows what it means to fight for something that matters, and subscribe to Wild West Stories so you never miss a story that stays with you long after it ends.
The first bullet punched through the storehouse window at 3 in the morning. Glass shattered inward, scattering across wooden crates stacked with late harvest apples. Eliza Moore grabbed her sister Ruth by the collar and hauled her flat against the floorboards. A second shot followed, splintering the doorframe above their heads. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the sweet rot of stored fruit, and somewhere outside, a horse screamed. Eliza pressed her hand over Ruth's mouth before the girl could cry out. They lay in darkness, breathing sawdust and fear, while the echo of those 2 shots rolled across the Wyoming prairie like distant thunder. But that was tonight. And tonight only made sense if you understood what happened 6 weeks earlier, inside Porter's Mercantile, when all Eliza Moore wanted in this world was a spool of white thread. 6 weeks before the bullets, on a September afternoon hot enough to crack leather, Eliza walked the 3 miles from the Moore orchard into Copper Bend. Dust coated the hem of her calico dress, the one with blue flowers faded to ghosts from years of washing. Her basket hung against her ribs, light enough to carry but heavy with purpose. Thread and buttons. Simple things. Survival things. Her father Daniel had died 8 months prior. Stroke at his desk, fountain pen still in his hand. The foreclosure letter from Thornton's bank lying open in front of him like an accusation. Eliza had found him. She never told anyone that detail, never described how his fingers had curled around that pen, as if he'd been trying to write one final argument against the numbers that were killing him. She carried that image the way she carried everything else, silently, without complaint. Because complaint required energy she could not spare. She ran the 40-acre orchard alone now, with Ruth, who was 17 and restless, and increasingly resentful of the life that kept them both chained to those old apple trees. Porter's Mercantile smelled the way it always did. Leather and tobacco and new fabric, and the particular warmth of a building that served as Copper Bend's unofficial gathering place. Eliza stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust from the harsh September glare, and moved toward the notions counter where Thomas Porter kept the thread and buttons behind glass. She heard Adelaide Thornton before she saw her. Well now, look who decided to grace us with her presence. Adelaide stood near the fabric bolts, flanked by Margaret Carlyle and Patience Whitmore, like a general positioned between 2 loyal officers. Adelaide wore green silk that caught the window light. Margaret's burgundy taffeta whispered when she breathed. Patience wore cream-colored lace so clean it might never have encountered honest dust. The store went quiet. Thomas Porter's hand froze above the cash register. Two farmers near the feed section looked up from their conversation. Even the dust motes seemed to slow their drift through shafts of afternoon sun. Eliza kept walking, steady steps, chin level. She had survived drought and death, and the kind of loneliness that sits on your chest at 3 in the morning and dares you to keep breathing. She could survive Adelaide Thornton. 3 yards of white thread, she said to Thomas, and a card of bone buttons. The small ones. Thomas nodded and turned to gather her order, moving with the careful neutrality of a young man who understood exactly who held power in this town. His family owned the store. Adelaide's husband held the mortgage. Adelaide drifted closer, running gloved fingers over a bolt of calico, as if inspecting it for disease. Her companions followed. Margaret on the left, Patience on the right. A formation as deliberate as any cavalry maneuver. "Those hands," Adelaide said. She was not speaking to Eliza directly. She was performing for her audience, voice pitched to carry to every corner of the store. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to have a lady's hands instead of a field worker's?" Eliza looked at her own hands resting on the counter. Calloused palms. A scar across the left knuckle from a pruning accident 2 winters back. Fingernails trimmed short for practical reasons. A burn mark from the canning pot that had never quite faded. She raised her eyes to Adelaide Thornton and held them there. "I would rather have hands calloused from honest labor than a conscience calloused from watching cruelty and calling it entertainment, Mrs. Thornton." The store stopped breathing. Adelaide's face drained of color. Eliza had struck bone, and they both knew it. Margaret Carlyle's mouth opened slightly. Patience Whitmore took a half-step backward. But Adelaide Thornton had not maintained her position at the top of Copper Bend's social hierarchy by folding under pressure. She recovered with the speed of a woman who had been practicing cruelty for 20 years. "I heard the bank is foreclosing on your orchard." Her voice was bright now, weaponized. "My husband says the debt is past due. Such a shame. 3 generations of Moors. And it all ends with a girl who cannot keep the books straight." This was information Eliza did not have. The thread slipped from her fingers and dropped silently to the counter. She felt the blood leave her face, felt the floor shift beneath her as the word foreclosure rearranged everything she thought she knew about her family's precarious survival. Adelaide smiled, the smile of a woman who had found the blade that cuts deepest. "That is enough." The voice came from the back of the store, not loud, not angry, but carrying weight the way bedrock carries a mountain. It was the kind of authority that did not need volume, because it had never needed to shout. Every head turned. A man stood near the hardware section, tall, broad through the shoulders, with dust on his dark wool trousers and the sleeves of his work shirt rolled to his elbows. He had been examining wire cutters, standing so still that nobody had noticed him. He set the cutters down and walked toward the front of the store. His boots struck the wooden floor with steady, even steps. He did not hurry. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, "I expect your husband would not appreciate you disclosing a client's financial information in a public establishment. That is a violation of banking law in this territory." Adelaide's brightness flickered. She knew this man. Everyone in 3 counties knew this man. Caleb Rowan, largest cattle operation in the territory. 3,000 head across grazing lands stretching into 2 separate counties. 40 men on payroll year-round. A fortune built from nothing by a man whose hands were as rough as Eliza's own. "Mr. Rowan," Adelaide managed, smoothing her skirts. "We were simply making conversation." Caleb did not look at her. He looked at Eliza, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Not pity, not the gallant concern of a man rushing to defend a damsel. Something heavier, something that looked almost like pain. "Miss Moore," he said quietly, "you handled yourself just fine before I stepped in. I should not have interrupted." Then he picked up his wire cutters, paid Thomas Porter 40 cents, and walked out the door without looking back. Eliza watched him go. The afternoon light caught his shoulders as he stepped onto the boardwalk, and she noticed the way he carried himself. Straight-backed but weary. The posture of a man bearing something heavier than dust and leather. His eyes, when they had met hers, held neither pity nor admiration. What she saw there looked like guilt. And guilt, in Eliza's experience, always meant someone was hiding something worth finding. She paid for her thread with steady hands, tucked it into her basket, and walked past Adelaide without a word. The 3 miles home felt longer than usual, and not because of the heat. Caleb Rowan had killed 2 men in his life, both times justified before God and the law, both times during his years as an Army scout, when the territory was younger and wilder and human life was weighed against survival with brutal arithmetic. He had made his peace with those deaths the way soldiers do, by folding them into small compartments and locking the doors. But the crime that stole his sleep every night had not spilled a single drop of blood. He rode back to the ranch after the mercantile scene, his bay gelding eating up the miles with the mechanical efficiency of an animal accustomed to long distances. The landscape scrolled past in shades of brown and gold. 3,000 head of cattle dotted the grazing land in clusters that looked small from horseback, but numbered in the hundreds up close. Fences stretched toward horizons. Everything spoke of success built through 2 decades of work that would have broken softer men. The main house appeared against the sky, 2 stories of timber and stone with smoke rising from a single chimney. It was large but practical, the house of a man who understood construction and comfort, but had never bothered with beauty. Inside, there were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no photographs on the walls. It was a place to sleep between working days, and it had been exactly that for 20 years. Caleb unsaddled his horse, rubbed the animal down with practiced hands, and walked into the house that echoed with the particular silence of rooms that had never known laughter or conversation or the sound of someone else breathing. He sat at his desk and tried not to think about Eliza Moore. He failed, not because she was beautiful, though she was, in the way weathered wood was beautiful, all strength and grain and honest wear, because she was Daniel Moore's daughter, the man whose name Caleb had written on a list 15 years ago. The man whose financial ruin Caleb had helped engineer, even if he had quit before completing the job. 15 years earlier. Caleb, at 29, broke and burning with the desperate hunger of a man who had raised himself after running from a father who drank whiskey the way other men drank water, and who believed a leather belt could cure any disobedience a boy might show. Caleb left home at 14 with nothing but the clothes on his back, and the sure knowledge that if he stayed, his father would eventually kill him. He lived rough for 2 years, slept in barns, worked odd jobs, ate when he could, and went hungry when he could not. At 16, the Army took him, and for the first time in his life, he had regular meals and a purpose and men who depended on him. After the Army, he drifted into the Wyoming Territory with knowledge of land, water, and livestock that he had accumulated the way other men accumulated scars. He was smart, and he was hungry. And when Gerard Thornton offered him a partnership, he did not think twice. The arrangement was simple. Caleb would survey homesteads and identify which families were most vulnerable to financial pressure. Bad water access, expiring leases, over-leveraged loans. Gerard would use his bank to apply that pressure, squeezing families until they sold cheap. They would split the profits. For 2 years, Caleb mapped 12 homesteads, documented their weaknesses with the same precision he had once used to map enemy positions for the Army. Gerard moved on the first 5. Families lost everything. Caleb watched from a comfortable distance and told himself it was just business. Then, one morning, he saw a woman carrying her children's clothes out of a foreclosed house in a flour sack. Her face held the expression of someone who had just learned that the world was not merely indifferent to her suffering, but actively designed to produce it. Her youngest child, a boy of maybe 3, was crying because he did not understand why they were leaving. Something inside Caleb cracked that morning. Not broke. Cracked. Like a beam bearing too much weight. He walked into Gerard's office the next day and quit, burned his copies of the maps. Or thought he had. One notebook survived, buried in a desk drawer and forgotten. The notebook with Moor Orchard, 40 acres. Vulnerable circled in red ink. Gerard did not need Caleb after that. He had learned the method. He continued alone, refining the system, growing more aggressive over the following decade. 7 more families lost their land. Daniel Moore and his orchard survived longer than most because Daniel was stubborn and smart. But the pressure never stopped. And 8 months ago, that pressure had put Daniel Moore in the ground with a foreclosure letter still in his hand. Caleb had spent 15 years trying to outrun the guilt. He could not. It rode harder than any horse. He opened his personal ledger, the one Frank Dalton knew about, and nobody else did. Every year for 15 years, Caleb had sent money anonymously to the families Gerard had destroyed, a third of ranch profits. He lived simply not because he valued simplicity, but because he was punishing himself. The ledger was his private confession. It had never been enough. Hoofbeats outside pulled him from the past. Frank Dalton rode up to the porch, his weathered face set in the particular expression that meant bad news. "Boss," Frank said, swinging down from his saddle, "someone poisoned the Moore family's draft horse last night. Animal's dead." Caleb felt the words settle in his stomach like stones. Not disease? Not unless disease comes in a feed bag laced with arsenic. Frank pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead. Old Pete Warren found it this morning when he rode past. Horse was dead in the paddock. Foam around the mouth, eyes rolled back. Caleb understood immediately. Without a draft horse, Eliza could not haul her harvest to market. Another squeeze in the vise that Gerard Thornton was tightening around the Moore orchard. He stood at the window looking out at his empire of cattle and grass and thought about choices. Help Eliza and risk his 15-year secret surfacing. Stand aside and watch Gerard swallow the Moore orchard the way he had swallowed 5 others, with maps that Caleb drew. That night, after Frank had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch settled into the deep quiet of a territory darkness, Caleb pulled open the bottom desk drawer and lifted out the yellowed notebook. He opened it to the page he had memorized. There, in his own handwriting, circled in red ink that had faded to the color of dried blood. Moore Orchard, 40 acres, vulnerable. Tomorrow he would ride to that orchard and drive fence posts into ground he had once marked for destruction. Whether that made him a good man or just a guilty one, he honestly could not say. The richest man in 3 counties was driving fence posts on her land at 6 in the morning, and Eliza Moore could not decide whether to thank him or fetch her father's shotgun. She woke to the sound of a post maul striking cedar, that particular rhythmic thud that carries across still morning air like a slow heartbeat. She pulled on her work boots, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill, and stepped outside. Caleb Rowan stood at the south boundary of her property, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat already darkening his shirt despite the cold. A man she recognized as Frank Dalton, his ranch foreman, worked alongside him. Between them sat a wagon loaded with fresh-cut cedar posts. The 2 men moved with the wordless efficiency of people accustomed to physical labor, each anticipating the other's next motion without discussion. Eliza marched across the yard. She planted herself between Caleb and the next post hole with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "What are you doing on my land, Mr. Rowan?" He straightened up, wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, met her eyes directly. She noticed again how his gaze carried that weight she had seen in the mercantile, something more complex than simple kindness. "Your south boundary fence is failing," he said. "I know the bank has been pressuring you. A broken boundary fence gives them legal grounds to claim you are not maintaining the property per loan conditions. I figured you would rather have posts than a foreclosure notice." Eliza felt her stomach drop. She had read her father's loan documents 3 times after his death, laboring through the dense legal language by lamplight until her eyes ached. She had not caught that particular clause. "How do you know about that clause?" Caleb's expression did not change, but she caught the smallest hesitation before he answered. "I have had my own dealings with bankers. You learn their tricks or you lose your shirt." It was not quite a lie. But it was not quite the truth either, and Eliza filed that distinction away in the same mental ledger where she kept track of the orchard's debts and the weather patterns and every other factor that determined whether she and Ruth would survive another season. "This is not charity," she said flatly. "I will repay every post. Bread, preserved fruit, whatever you need that I can provide. We trade fair or we do not trade at all." Caleb nodded once. "Fair enough." They worked through the day. Eliza was not too proud to accept help she needed, but she was not too trusting to accept it without watching. She watched Caleb Rowan the way she watched the sky before a storm, looking for signs that most people missed. He worked hard, and he worked well. His hands on the post maul were sure and practiced, the hands of a man who had built things with his own labor, and not just with money. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were practical and direct, never condescending, never explaining things she already knew. Somewhere around mid-morning, as they worked side by side, setting a post into the rocky soil of the south section, they fell into the particular rhythm that only develops between people who understand physical work, passing tools without asking, holding posts steady without being told. The wordless cooperation of shared labor that communicates more than conversation ever could. Eliza found herself impressed, despite her caution. Caleb asked her about the orchard's irrigation, and she explained the system her grandfather had designed, fed by a seasonal creek that ran dry in August and had to be supplemented by well water. He listened carefully, asked intelligent questions about water rights and soil drainage, and offered suggestions that showed genuine understanding of agricultural management. He, in turn, was surprised by her knowledge of markets and timing. "You sell your harvest through the cooperative in Cheyenne?" he asked. "Not anymore. The cooperative takes 15%, and they hold payment for 60 days. I cannot afford to wait 60 days. I sell directly to 3 merchants in Copper Bend and 2 in Laramie. Smaller volume, but immediate payment, and I set my own prices. That is smart business. That is survival, Mr. Rowan. Smart business is a luxury for people who have options." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something shift behind his eyes. Not pity, recognition. The look of a man seeing something he had not expected to find. They broke for a noon meal that Eliza provided. Bread she had baked that morning, preserved pears, cold water from the well. Simple food, but Caleb ate with genuine appetite. "This bread is the best I have had in years," he said. "My ranch cook turns out biscuits that could patch a roof." "Your cook is a man?" "His name is Silas McCready. Came west from Tennessee after the war. Good man, terrible baker. The hands eat his bread anyway because they are too scared of him to complain." Eliza felt the corner of her mouth twitch. It was not quite a smile, but it was close, and she could not remember the last time she had come that close to smiling in the company of a man she did not know. Ruth appeared on the porch that afternoon, watching from a distance. Later, when Caleb and Frank had ridden back to the wagon for more posts, Ruth cornered her sister in the kitchen. "Do you like him?" Eliza kept her eyes on the bread dough she was kneading for tomorrow. "I do not trust him." Ruth leaned against the doorframe with the languid confidence of a 17-year-old who believed she understood the world better than she did. "That is not what I asked." "No," Eliza agreed. "It is not." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Eliza carried with her for a long time afterward. "You do not have to trust someone to see that they are good, Eliza. Sometimes you can see both things at once, the good and the hiding." Eliza's hands stilled in the dough. "When did you get so wise?" "When you were not looking." Ruth grinned and disappeared outside, and Eliza heard her calling questions to Frank about ranch life that the foreman answered with patient good humor. Late in the afternoon, while repairing fence on the south section nearest the Thornton property line, Caleb discovered something that changed the temperature of the day. Eliza was 20 yards behind him, carrying a coil of wire when she saw him stop, crouch, and examine the ground with the focused attention of a man reading a language most people did not know existed. She watched him trace his fingers along the wire of the existing fence, watched his jaw tighten, watched him stand and look east toward the Thornton property, with an expression that was no longer guilt or sadness or anything she could name. It was cold. The coldness of a man staring at something he recognized. "What did you find?" she asked. He turned. For a heartbeat, she thought he was going to tell her. Then the shutters closed behind his eyes, and he said, "Nothing. Just checking the tension on this old wire." It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. He knew she knew, and the fact that he lied anyway told her more than the truth would have. That night, after Caleb and Frank had ridden off into the deepening dusk, Eliza sat at her father's desk with the oil lamp burning low. She pulled out every letter from Thornton's bank going back 15 years, and she spread them across the desk like pieces of a puzzle. The letters showed a pattern: reasonable terms in the early years, then slowly escalating pressure. Interest rate adjustments that always seemed to arrive after a bad harvest. Inspection requirements that grew more demanding each season. Clause modifications buried in dense paragraphs that would take a lawyer to catch and a lawyer's fee to fight. Someone had designed this trap with precision. Someone who understood land and farming and knew exactly where the pressure points were. Eliza looked at the letters for a long time. Then she looked at the empty chair where her father used to sit, and she thought about Caleb Rowan, who knew things about banking law that no honest cattle rancher should know. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the mercantile. Not with pity or admiration, but with something heavier. Guilt. She was starting to wonder if the man who had come to repair her fences knew the shape of the trap her family had been caught in better than he was willing to say, because he might have helped build it. Eliza Moore had learned to read men the way she read weather, by watching what they did when they thought nobody was paying attention. And Caleb Rowan, for all his quiet authority, was doing something no honest rancher should have been able to do. He was predicting Gerard Thornton's next moves before Thornton made them. Over the following week, Caleb visited twice more. He helped repair the irrigation channel that fed the orchard's north section, working alongside Eliza in the cold autumn mud with a focus that seemed almost penitential. He brought a replacement draft horse on loan from his ranch. A sturdy bay mare with calm eyes and good feet, accompanied by the explanation that the animal was eating feed and not earning it, and Caleb would rather she pull her weight on the Moore property than stand around getting fat in his paddock. Each time he came, he offered information about what Gerard might do next. Not speculation, certainty. He knew which county clerk Gerard would pressure to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. He knew which legal filing deadlines mattered and which were flexible. He knew the exact sequence of escalation that a banker used when squeezing a property owner. Eliza tested him. Over coffee on the porch, she mentioned a specific clause in her father's original loan agreement, something about mineral rights that Daniel had once pointed out as unusual. Caleb's reaction was brief, a microsecond tightening around his eyes, a fractional pause before his next sip of coffee. But Eliza caught it. He had seen that clause before, not in her father's paperwork. The next day, she rode into Copperbend alone. She did not go to the mercantile or the general store or any of the places where people would notice Eliza Moore and wonder what she was doing. She went to the county clerk's office and requested public records of land transfers over the previous 15 years. The clerk, a mild-mannered man named Phelps, who had known Eliza's father, provided the records without question. Eliza sat at a scarred wooden table in the corner of the office and read them with the same precision she used to grade apples for market. The pattern emerged slowly. 12 homesteads had been acquired by various entities over 15 years, all of which she traced back through layered paperwork to Gerard Thornton, or companies he controlled. 5 of those acquisitions had happened within a concentrated 2-year period, approximately 15 years ago. Then a gap. Then 7 more over the following decade, using similar methods but executed less cleanly. The gap fascinated her. Someone had been helping Gerard during those first 5 acquisitions. Someone who understood land, water, soil, and the economics of small farming operations. Then that someone stopped, and Gerard had to learn to operate alone. She thought about a man who appeared in the territory roughly 15 years ago with knowledge of land management and enough seed money to establish a cattle operation from nothing. She thought about calloused hands driving fence posts on her property, about a voice that said, "I have had my own dealings with bankers." Eliza rode home with her mind working faster than her horse's hooves. She did not confront Caleb when he arrived the following afternoon with spare lumber for the orchard's main gate. Instead, she changed. She became cordial where she had been warming, professional where she had been personal. She accepted his help and offered coffee and conversation. But the current beneath her words had shifted. She was no longer deciding whether to trust him. She was cataloging evidence. Caleb noticed. He noticed because he was a man who had spent his life reading landscapes and situations and people, and because the warmth in Eliza's eyes had been replaced by something cooler and more deliberate. She still looked at him directly. She still spoke with her characteristic honesty. But there was assessment behind her gaze now, and Caleb recognized it the way a man recognizes a storm front building on the horizon. That night, back at his ranch, Caleb sat with Frank Dalton on the bunkhouse porch while the hands played cards inside, and the autumn darkness settled over the territory like a wool blanket. "She is figuring you out," Frank said. He was cleaning a saddle with the methodical attention he gave everything, his scarred hands working oil into leather. "That woman is smarter than both of us put together." "I know. You should tell her." "I know that too. But you will not." Caleb was quiet for the long time. Telling her means losing her. Frank stopped cleaning. He looked at his boss with the particular directness of a man who had served 2 years in the territorial prison for a crime of desperation and who had been given a second chance by the very man now sitting beside him, wrestling with his conscience. "Losing her because you told the truth is better than losing her because she found it out herself. Trust me on that one. I know something about secrets and what they cost." Caleb stared into the darkness and did not answer. 2 days later, a rider delivered a letter to the Moore orchard. Red stamped, official, bearing the seal of Thornton's bank. Eliza opened it at the kitchen table with Ruth standing in the doorway and the last of the autumn sunlight falling through the window like a benediction that had arrived too late. 30 days. She had 30 days to pay the full outstanding balance on the property loan or forfeit the orchard to the bank. Ruth's face went white. Eliza read the letter twice because Moore women always read documents twice. Then she set it down on the table, smoothed the paper flat with hands that wanted to shake but did not, and looked through the window at the orchard. Her grandfather's trees, her father's life. Her own identity rooted in that soil as surely as the deepest taproot. 30 days. She had 30 days to save 3 generations of Moore labor and heartbreak from a man who stole land the way other men stole horses. Legally, quietly, and without mercy. The only person alive who knew every trick in Gerard Thornton's book was a man she was increasingly certain had helped write it. Eliza folded the foreclosure letter precisely into thirds, placed it in her apron pocket, and stood up. "Where are you going?" Ruth asked. "To start a war," Eliza said, and she walked out the door. Eliza had 30 days to save the land that 3 generations of Moors had watered with sweat. And she started by doing the last thing anyone in Copper Bend would have predicted. She saddled the bay mare Caleb had loaned her, rode 8 miles in the opposite direction from the Rowan Ranch, and knocked on the front door of the Thornton mansion. The housekeeper, a thin woman with anxious eyes, tried to turn her away. "Miss Moore, Mrs. Thornton is not receiving visitors this morning. Tell Mrs. Thornton that Eliza Moore is here to discuss her husband's banking practices. She can receive me now, or she can receive the territorial marshal later. Her choice." The housekeeper disappeared. 3 minutes later, Adelaide Thornton appeared on the staircase wearing a morning dress that cost more than the Moore orchard earned in a month. Her face showed genuine shock. Not the performative surprise of a society woman, but the raw, unguarded shock of someone confronted with a reality they had been avoiding. They sat in Adelaide's parlor, fine furniture, heavy curtains, a room designed to project wealth and stability. But Eliza noticed the details that contradicted the display. The faint circle on the wallpaper where a painting had been removed and not replaced. The slight wear on the carpet near the doorway where Adelaide's pacing had worn a path. The way Adelaide's hands never quite settled, moving from her lap to the armrest to the teacup and back again. "Mrs. Thornton," Eliza said without preamble, "your husband is going to take my land. You know this. I know this. But I also believe you know that what he is doing is not merely unfair, it is criminal, and I believe you have known for a very long time." Adelaide's composure held for approximately 5 seconds. Then it crumbled, not dramatically, but with the slow, inevitable collapse of something that had been bearing too much weight for too many years. "What makes you think I would help you? If Gerard finds out, I lose everything. My house, my standing, my children's futures." Eliza leaned forward. "You are already losing everything. Your husband barely speaks to you. Your daughter will not let you plan her wedding because she is ashamed of you. You spend your days performing superiority to fill the space where your self-respect used to be." She paused. "I know this because I watched your face in the mercantile. When you mocked my hands, you were not looking at me. You were looking at yourself and hating what you saw." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the mercantile. That silence had been sharp with cruelty. This one was raw with truth. "He keeps the real books in the safe in his study," Adelaide said finally. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The ones he shows the territorial auditor are fabricated. The real ledgers show embezzled deposits, manipulated loan terms, and forged property assessments going back 15 years. She looked at Eliza with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated exhaustion. "I have seen both sets. Help me get those books. I will make sure you and your children are protected when he falls." "Protected by whom?" "You have nothing. I have the truth. And the truth does not need collateral." Adelaide studied her for a long moment. The orchard girl in the patched calico sitting across from the banker's wife in the silk morning dress. Two women on opposite sides of every line that Copper Bend drew between people. And yet here they sat, united by the simple mathematics of survival. Adelaide agreed. But she added a warning that changed the shape of Eliza's plans entirely. "Gerard has a man. His name is Hector Vance. He handles the problems that cannot be solved with paperwork. If Gerard even suspects what we are doing, Vance will come. And Hector Vance does not come to talk." Eliza filed the name away. She thanked Adelaide with a formality that surprised them both, mounted her horse, and rode toward home. The ride back crossed 6 miles of open prairie. Flat grassland stretching to the horizon in every direction, the kind of landscape where you could see a rider approaching from 2 miles out, which is why Eliza noticed the horseman. He appeared to her left, perhaps 100 yards distant, a man on a dark horse, riding at exactly her pace, not approaching, not falling behind, just maintaining parallel distance with the easy precision of someone accustomed to tracking. Eliza's hands tightened on the reins. She knew, with the bone-deep instinct of a woman who had survived alone on the frontier, that this was not a coincidence. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and told herself that fear was useful only if it drove action, not paralysis. 2 miles. The rider followed for 2 miles across empty grassland without closing the distance or making a sound. The silence was worse than any threat she could imagine. A man who shouted at you wanted to intimidate. A man who followed in silence wanted you to understand that he could reach you whenever he chose. As she neared the Moore property line, the rider closed the gap. 30 yards, 20. He pulled alongside at 10 yards, and she saw his face for the first time. Lean and weathered and utterly expressionless. A face that gave away nothing and promised nothing good. "Nice land," he said. His voice was flat, conversational, as if commenting on the weather. Shame it will not be yours much longer." Then he turned his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. He made no sound as he left. She noticed that particularly. Even his horse's hooves seemed to strike the ground without noise. Eliza rode the remaining distance to the orchard with her heartbeat pounding in her ears, and her mind already working through possibilities and responses and plans. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. She converted it to anger, and anger to strategy, the way her father had taught her to convert worthless windfalls into cider that actually turned a profit. She arrived home to find Ruth crouched behind the east storehouse, holding a kerosene-soaked rag she had found near the foundation. "Someone poured kerosene around the building last night," Ruth said. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "I found boot tracks heading east. I followed them to the tree line before I lost them." He went toward the Thornton property. "You followed boot tracks alone?" Eliza heard her voice rise and forced it down. "Ruth, that was dangerous. Someone had to. You were gone." The words hit Eliza harder than she expected. Not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact from a 17-year-old girl who was tired of waiting while her older sister handled everything alone. They looked at each other across the yard, and Eliza saw something she had been too busy to notice. Ruth was not a child anymore. She was young, and sometimes reckless and occasionally foolish, but she was also brave and observant and unwilling to sit idle while their home was threatened. She was a Moor. She had the same stubbornness rooted in her bones. Eliza walked out to the orchard gate before nightfall to check the latch, a habit born of vigilance rather than necessity, and found something hanging from the crossbar that stopped the air in her lungs. A rope, tied into a noose, swaying gently in the evening breeze. No note, no name. The message did not need words. She cut it down with her pruning knife. Her hands were steady even though her heart was hammering hard enough to crack ribs. She carried the rope inside and placed it on the kitchen table next to the foreclosure letter. She would not burn it. She would keep it. Evidence weighed more than fear, and Eliza Moore was building a case. Frank Dalton found Caleb in the horse barn at midnight, not drinking because Caleb never drank. His father had been a drunk, and the bottle had turned that man into a monster. And Caleb carried the fear of becoming his father, the way other men carried pocket watches. Always present, always consulted, always guiding decisions. He was not sleeping either. He was sitting in the dark on an upturned feed bucket, cleaning a rifle he had sworn after the army he would never fire again. The Winchester was old but maintained with the obsessive care of a man who understood that tools either worked when you needed them or they did not, and there was no middle ground. "You going to tell me what is happening?" Frank said. He leaned against the barn door with his arms crossed. Lamplight from the bunkhouse threw his shadow long across the straw-covered floor. "Or do I have to hear it from the town gossip chain?" Gerard sent a foreclosure notice to the Moore property. 30 days. Frank swore quietly. "And the noose?" Caleb's hands stilled on the rifle. "You heard about that?" Pete Warren heard from Thomas Porter, who heard from the feed man who delivers to both ranches. "Small territory, boss. News travels." Caleb set the rifle across his knees. "Gerard has brought in Hector Vance." The name landed between them like a dropped stone. Frank had never served in the army, but he knew the name. Every man in the territory knew it. Hector Vance was the kind of problem that did not solve itself and could not be negotiated with. He was a man whose skills had been shaped by war and then refined by the discovery that those skills had civilian applications that paid considerably better than government wages. What Frank did not know, what almost nobody knew, was that Caleb and Vance had served together, same unit during the Powder River campaigns, same miserable winter marches, same desperate skirmishes, same particular brand of hell that the Army reserved for men stationed at the frontier's sharpest edges. Vance had been a good soldier, disciplined, fearless, efficient in ways that made commanding officers grateful and fellow soldiers uneasy. During a skirmish with a Cheyenne raiding party, Caleb had pulled Vance from a collapsed defensive position under heavy fire, dragged him 30 yards across open ground with arrows cutting the air around them, saved his life. They had parted ways after mustering out. Caleb built a ranch. Vance hired out the only skills the army had given him. The territory was full of men like Vance, men who had been trained for violence and then turned loose into a world that offered them no alternative employment. Frank studied Caleb's face in the dim light. She needs to know Vance is coming. She told me to leave her property. She does not want my help. She told you to leave because you were hiding something. You are still hiding something. Frank's voice carried the blunt authority of a man who had learned truth-telling in a territorial prison cell where pretense was a luxury nobody could afford. The difference is now the something might get her killed. If you keep that information from her because your pride is hurt, you are no different from Gerard, using power to decide what other people get to know. The words hit like a slap. Caleb sat in silence for a long time, running his thumb along the rifle's stock, feeling the smooth wood that had been polished by years of handling. I will ride out in the morning. Tell her about Vance. Let her decide what she wants. And Caleb? Frank paused at the barn door. Tell her everything else, too. All of it. Before someone else does. Caleb did not answer. But an hour later he was saddling his horse in the dark because morning felt too far away and the wind was building from the north with the particular raw edge that meant snow. The blizzard hit before he reached the halfway point. It came the way Wyoming storms always came, fast and absolute. One moment the stars were visible through thin clouds. The next moment the world was white and screaming. Wind drove snow horizontal across the open prairie, cutting through his wool coat and leather gloves like they were made of paper. The temperature dropped so fast that the moisture in his horse's nostrils began to freeze, and Caleb had to dismount and breathe into the animal's face to keep the airways clear. He considered turning back. The ranch was behind him, warm and safe and full of men who would not judge him for choosing survival over sentimentality. But the Moore orchard was ahead, and somewhere in that darkness Eliza and Ruth were alone with kerosene-soaked ground around their storehouse, and a hired killer who made no sound when he moved. He remounted and pushed forward. Meanwhile, at the Moore orchard, Ruth was not sleeping either. She had been tracking patterns for days, boot prints appearing near the buildings at night, fence wire freshly cut in sections nobody would notice unless they walked the entire perimeter. A horse tied in the tree line at odd hours, visible only because Ruth had taken to sitting at her bedroom window after dark, watching the property the way a guard dog watches a gate. That evening she had found something new. Hidden beneath brush in the tree line east of the storehouse, a canvas bag containing 3 sets of cattle hobbles branded with the Thornton mark, and a bill of sale so badly forged that even Ruth could see the handwriting did not match the supposed seller's signature. She understood immediately, not the legal details, but the shape of it. Someone was planting evidence on Moore land. Hobbles and bills of sale meant cattle, and even a 17-year-old girl in Wyoming territory knew what happened to cattle thieves. She hid the evidence in the storehouse, behind the stacked apple crates where nobody would look. Then she went back to her window and watched. She did not have to watch long. A figure emerged from the tree line just past 11, moving toward the storehouse with the careful deliberation of someone who had done this before. Ruth smelled kerosene before she saw the lantern. She was out the back door and running before she had time to be afraid. She shouted. The figure startled. The lantern dropped. Glass shattered against the kerosene-soaked wood of the storehouse wall. The fire caught immediately. Caleb crested the last ridge above the Moore property and saw the light. Not lamplight from the farmhouse. Not starlight through the broken clouds of a passing blizzard. Fire, climbing the east storehouse wall like a living thing, painting the snow orange and black. And silhouetted against the flames, 2 figures, one running away into the darkness, one running toward the burning building, because Ruth Moore was still inside, having gone back for the evidence she had hidden. And Eliza Moore was already running through fire to reach her sister. The fire took the storehouse, 3 months of stored apples, and nearly took Ruth Moore. But it also burned away the last barrier between Eliza and a truth she had been resisting. She could not fight this alone. And accepting help was not the same as accepting defeat. The sequence of events unfolded in the compressed time that emergencies create, where minutes feel like hours and hours pass in seconds. Eliza reached the storehouse first. The east wall was fully engulfed, flames feeding on the kerosene that had soaked into dry timber. Smoke poured through every crack and gap in the building's old construction. She could hear Ruth coughing inside. She went in through the loading door on the west side, pulling her shawl over her nose and mouth. The heat was a physical force pressing against her skin. Visibility was measured in inches. She could not see Ruth, but she could hear her, somewhere near the back wall, and she navigated by sound and memory, moving between stacked crates that were already beginning to smolder. She found Ruth on the floor. A ceiling beam had cracked and fallen, pinning Ruth's leg beneath its weight. Ruth was conscious, gripping a canvas bag to her chest, her face smeared with soot and tears. "I could not leave it," Ruth gasped. "The evidence! They are framing us for cattle theft." Eliza grabbed the beam, pulled with everything she had. It shifted 3 inches and stopped. Too heavy, too awkward. She needed leverage or she needed help, and the ceiling above them was starting to sag. Then Caleb was there. He came through the smoke like something out of a dream. Coat smoking where embers had landed, face set in the focused calm of a man who had once pulled a wounded soldier across 30 yards of open ground under fire. He did not ask questions. He did not waste words. He positioned himself on the opposite end of the beam, planted his boots, and looked at Eliza. "On 3, he said. They lifted together. The beam rose enough for Ruth to drag her leg clear. Caleb scooped the girl up with one arm, the canvas bag still clutched to her chest, and carried her toward the door. Eliza followed. The roof collapsed behind them. Burning timber caught Caleb across the shoulders and upper back as they cleared the doorway. He went down on one knee in the snow, shielding Ruth with his body. Eliza grabbed his collar and dragged him forward, away from the falling debris, and the 3 of them lay in the snow watching the storehouse become a column of flame against the black sky. Ruth was bruised, but whole. Her leg was badly swollen where the beam had pinned it, but nothing was broken. She lay in the snow, gripping her canvas bag like a lifeline, breathing in great shuddering gasps. Caleb's back was worse. Burns across both shoulders, blistering even before Eliza could assess the damage. His shirt had melted into the wounds in places, and she knew from years of treating orchard injuries that removing fabric from a burn required care and clean water and time. "He needs a doctor," Ruth said. Caleb shook his head. "Doc Henderson owes Gerard money. I would rather take my chances with honest nursing than walk into a man's office and wonder if he is treating me or reporting me." So Eliza tended his burns on the kitchen table where her family had eaten every meal for 3 generations. She boiled water and tore clean linen into strips and worked with the steady hands that Adelaide Thornton had mocked, and that were now the only thing standing between this man and a wound that could turn septic. She cut away his ruined shirt, and beneath the fresh burns, she found the old scars. They were layered across his shoulders and spine, not random, patterned. The marks of a belt applied repeatedly over years, leaving raised tissue that had whitened with age. Childhood scars. The map of a brutal upbringing written on a man's body in the language of leather and pain. Her hands went still. She stood behind him, holding a strip of wet linen, staring at the history inscribed on his skin. 20 years of hard living overlaid with fresh burns. But the oldest wounds were still visible beneath everything. Caleb felt her hesitation. He spoke without turning around, his voice flat with the particular discipline of a man who had rehearsed this story in his own mind so many times it had lost its sharp edges. "My father was a drunk who believed leather cured disobedience. I left home at 14, lived rough for 2 years until the army would take me." A pause. The fire crackled in the stove. Ruth sat in the corner wrapped in blankets, watching with wide eyes. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I am telling you because you need to understand something. When you have had nothing your whole life, when every morning you wake up hungry and afraid and alone, a man like Gerard Thornton offering to make you rich sounds like salvation. I was 29 and stupid enough to believe money could fill the holes my father beat into me. Eliza resumed cleaning his wounds. Her hands moved with practiced gentleness, but her mind was racing. She was hearing the confession she had been suspecting for weeks, delivered not as an explanation, but as a simple statement of fact from a man who had stopped making excuses a long time ago. She dressed his burns in silence, applied the salve she kept for canning accidents, wrapped his shoulders in clean linen that she secured with pins because stitching would require him to hold still longer than the pain would allow. When she finished, she sat down across the table from him, coffee between them, the rifle she had retrieved from the bedroom leaning against the wall within reach, not pointed at him, just present. You talked in your sleep, she said, during the night when your fever was high. You mentioned a list, 12 families, Gerard's name, and Moore Orchard. Caleb's face showed nothing. Or rather, it showed everything because the absence of expression on a man's face is itself an expression, one that says the truth is too heavy for the muscles to carry. I do not need explanations right now, Eliza continued. What I need is an ally who knows how Gerard Thornton operates from the inside. Can you be that? Yes, then we work together until this is over. After that, we settle what is between us. Fair? Fair. They both knew the word was carrying weight it was never designed for. But it was enough to build on the way a single fence post was enough to start a boundary line. Ruth broke the silence by setting her canvas bag on the table and pulling out its contents. 3 sets of cattle hobbles branded with the Thornton mark. A bill of sale with a forged signature. Evidence she had risked her life to retrieve from a burning building. Someone is planting these on our property, Ruth said. Hobbles and a sale receipt for cattle we never bought. In Wyoming territory, what does it mean when they find another man's cattle equipment on your land? It means they arrest you for cattle theft, Caleb said quietly. And in this territory, cattle theft can be a hanging offense. The room went cold. They were still absorbing Ruth's discovery when the sound of hoofbeats carried through the morning air. Eliza moved to the window. The town sheriff sat astride his horse in the gray dawn light, flanked by 2 deputies. Behind them, a wagon with iron rings bolted to the sideboards. A prisoner wagon. The sheriff dismounted and approached the door, holding a folded paper. When Eliza opened the door, his face was the face of a man following orders he did not believe in. Eliza Moore, I have a warrant for your arrest. The charge is theft of 3 head of cattle bearing the Thornton brand, found on your property by report of a concerned citizen. You need to come with me. Eliza looked at the warrant, looked at the prisoner wagon, looked at Caleb, who was struggling to stand despite the burns that had not yet begun to heal, looked at Ruth, whose face was white with fury. She thought about running, thought about fighting, thought about the shotgun leaning against the wall, and the fact that resisting arrest would give Gerard Thornton exactly the excuse he needed to destroy her completely. Instead, she straightened her spine, pulled her shawl around her shoulders, and walked to the wagon under her own power. She did not look back. Moore women did not look back. They looked forward, even when forward looked like an iron cage on wheels. The last thing she heard before the wagon door closed was Caleb's voice, low and fierce, speaking to Frank, who had arrived with the dawn. Get Clara Briggs from Cheyenne. The lawyer. Sell whatever you have to sell to pay her fee. And find Adelaide Thornton. Tell her it is time. In Wyoming territory in 1887, cattle thieves hanged. Not always by order of a judge. Sometimes by order of men who did not bother with courtrooms, who carried their justice at the end of a rope slung over a convenient tree branch. and who slept soundly afterward with the satisfaction of citizens who had protected property rights with the most permanent enforcement available. Gerard Thornton, who understood the territory's rough justice better than most, was counting on exactly that kind of arithmetic. Eliza spent 48 hours in the Copper Bend jail, a single cell with a straw mattress, iron bars, and a window too small to see anything but a narrow strip of Wyoming sky. The sheriff, a man named Harlan Bryce, whose salary Gerard supplemented with a monthly envelope, treated her correctly, but distantly. He brought meals and fresh water and did not meet her eyes. She was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid, but the fear had been compressed by pressure and time into something harder and more useful. She sat on that straw mattress and thought, analyzed, planned. There were moments when the walls pressed in and the fear broke through. Moments when she stared at the iron bars and felt the full weight of what Gerard had done. She was a woman alone in a territory where women had few rights and fewer protections, accused of a crime that carried the possibility of death, by a man who controlled the bank and the sheriff and half the commerce in 3 counties. Adelaide had been right. In the Mercantile all those weeks ago, when she had mocked Eliza's poverty and helplessness, Adelaide had been right about the facts, if not the meaning. The sheriff left a pen and a property transfer form on the small table in her cell. Gerard's doing, clearly. Sign the orchard over. The charges disappear. Simple transaction. Business. Eliza picked up the pen. She held it over the signature line. Her hand was steady, she noted with grim humor. Even here, even now, her hands did not shake. Then she noticed the ink stain on her index finger, faded blue in the crease of her knuckle from recording the apple harvest grades in the orchard ledger. The same place her father had always had an ink stain from 20 years of keeping the orchard books in his careful handwriting. She heard his voice, clear as church bells on a still morning. More women do not sign papers they have not read twice, Eliza. She put the pen down, folded the transfer form into a small crane, a paper folding trick Ruth had taught her on a rainy afternoon when they were both too young to worry about foreclosures and cattle theft and hired killers. She set the crane on the windowsill facing the street. Let Gerard see his surrender document turned into a child's toy. Outside her cell, across the territory, Caleb Rowan was waging war on 3 fronts. He rode to Cheyenne in a single brutal day, his burned shoulders screaming with every mile. He found Clara Briggs in her small law office above the hardware store. She was one of the first female attorneys admitted to practice in the Wyoming Territory, which had led the nation in extending legal rights to women. She was also expensive. Caleb sold 200 head of cattle to cover her fee. Frank protested the loss. Caleb cut him off. I put her family on that list. The least I can do is sell some cows to keep her off a gallows. While Caleb secured legal representation, Frank and 2 trusted ranch hands staked out the Moore property. On the second night, they observed Hector Vance leading 2 more Thornton-branded cattle through a freshly cut section of boundary fence toward Moore land. They documented everything: time, location, direction of approach, the Thornton brand clearly visible on the animals' flanks. Vance spotted them and rode hard into the darkness. Frank let him go. He had what he needed. The third front was Adelaide Thornton. Ruth served as courier, riding to the Thornton mansion under the pretense of delivering preserved fruit. Adelaide had been preparing since her conversation with Eliza. She waited until Gerard left for his evening meeting at the Cattlemen's Club, opened the safe in his study, and copied the real ledgers into a bound notebook she hid beneath her mattress. 2 sets of books, one clean, showing a healthy bank with responsible lending practices, one true, showing embezzled deposits, manipulated loan terms, forged property assessments, and a 15-year pattern of deliberate financial predation against 12 homestead families. On the 3rd morning, Clara Briggs arrived in Copper Bend and petitioned the territorial magistrate for a preliminary hearing on the grounds of fabricated evidence and malicious prosecution. The magistrate, a man named Hargrove, who had no financial ties to Gerard Thornton, and who took his judicial responsibilities seriously, granted the hearing. It was held in the Copper Bend Town Hall, the largest building in town that was not a church. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls and crowded the doorway. The same faces that had watched Adelaide mock Eliza in the mercantile. The same social hierarchy, the same fault lines between rich and poor, powerful and vulnerable. But the stakes today were incomparably higher than a spool of white thread. Eliza was brought from the jail in a clean dress Ruth had delivered. Her hair was braided, and her face was composed, and her hands, those calloused working hands, were folded in her lap with a stillness that communicated more strength than any clenched fist. Clara Briggs spoke first, laying out the legal framework. Then Eliza rose and addressed the court in her own voice. She did not cry. She did not plead. She spoke with the precision of the farm manager she was, presenting evidence like line items in a ledger. Cut fences documented over weeks, kerosene found around the storehouse foundation, the forged bill of sale Ruth had recovered from the fire. Frank Dalton's eyewitness account of Hector Vance leading Thornton cattle onto Moore property. The magistrate listened carefully. Gerard's lawyer objected repeatedly and was repeatedly overruled. The crowd murmured. Gerard Thornton sat in the front row with the rigid posture of a man watching his careful construction begin to crumble. When Eliza finished presenting her evidence, he stood abruptly, bypassing his own attorney, and addressed the court directly. Your Honor, before this court accepts testimony offered on behalf of the accused by Caleb Rowan, perhaps Mr. Rowan should be asked to explain his own history with my bank. The room went quiet. That particular quality of silence that descends when people sense something terrible is about to be revealed. 15 years ago, Gerard continued, his voice steady and venomous, Caleb Rowan was my business partner. He surveyed homesteads for me, identified which families were vulnerable to financial pressure. He drew the maps. He wrote the assessments. 5 families lost their land based directly on his work. Gerard's smile was thin, including the Moore family. Ask Mr. Rowan. Ask him who circled Moore Orchard in red ink and wrote the word vulnerable beside it. The courtroom erupted. Voices, gasps, chairs scraping against the wooden floor. The magistrate called for order. Eliza turned to look at Caleb across the crowded room. The expression on her face was not what Caleb had braced himself for. He had expected anger, betrayal, the cold fury of a woman who had been deceived. What he saw was worse. He saw the face of a woman who had been piecing together a puzzle for weeks and had just watched the final piece click into place from the wrong direction. She had been building toward this truth through her own intelligence and investigation, and hearing it from Gerard, hearing it weaponized and stripped of context, was like watching her own detective work used as a bludgeon against her. The fragments from his fever, the suspicions she had been cataloging, the gap in the land records, his impossible knowledge of banking law. All of it crystallized into a single devastating picture, and it was worse because Gerard's version contained no remorse, just weaponized fact. Caleb stood. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. He looked at Eliza, saw the devastation in her eyes, did not flinch. Everything Gerard Thornton just said about me is true. The silence deepened. 15 years ago, I helped him draw maps to steal people's land. I did it because I was poor and greedy, and too morally weak to say no to easy money. I stopped after 2 years because I finally looked at the faces of the people I was helping to destroy. But stopping did not undo what I had already done, and it did not stop Gerard from continuing without me. He paused. The cost of each word was visible in the set of his jaw and the tension in his burned shoulders. I have spent 15 years trying to atone for that. I cannot. Some debts do not come with a payment plan. But if this court wants to know why I'm standing here today defending a woman accused of a crime she did not commit, I will tell you. His eyes held Eliza's across the room. Every person in the building disappeared. It was just the 2 of them and 15 years of unspoken truth. I am standing here because Eliza Moore is the finest woman in this room. Not because she is poor, not because she is brave, not because she endures what would break most people. She is the finest woman here Because when she started figuring out what I was, and she was figuring it out because she is smarter than every person in this building combined, she did not ask me to save her. She did not beg. She made her own alliances, gathered her own evidence, built her own case with her own hands and her own mind. I am just a guilty man trying to stand on the right side for once in his life. She is the one who built the ground I am standing on. The courtroom was absolutely still. Even the magistrate had stopped writing. Then the door opened. Adelaide Thornton walked in. She carried a leather-bound notebook, and she placed it on the magistrate's desk with the careful deliberation of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and what it was going to cost her. Gerard surged to his feet, his face the color of a sunset before a bad storm. "You treacherous woman! How dare you!" Adelaide did not flinch. Her voice carried across the silent room without a tremor. "No, Gerard. I am finally being honest, for the first time in 20 years of marriage." The magistrate opened the notebook. "Read the first page. Read the second." His eyebrows rose and did not come back down. He called a recess, during which he read 40 more pages of embezzled deposits, fabricated audits, forged property assessments, and a systematic 15-year campaign of financial predation against 12 homestead families. By sundown, the cattle theft charges against Eliza Moore were dismissed. Gerard Thornton was taken into custody by the territorial marshal, pending investigation for banking fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit theft by deception. He would be held at the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie to await proceedings. Eliza walked out of the town hall into cold air that tasted like freedom and unfinished business. The afternoon light was fading, painting the snow-covered street in shades of amber and blue. She did not look at Caleb. She could not. Not yet. The truth was still turning in her chest like a blade, and she needed time to decide whether it would destroy what was growing between them or cut away the last barrier keeping them apart. She was 3 steps down the boardwalk when the shots came. 2 of them, sharp and flat, carried across the winter air from the direction of the Rowan Ranch. Then silence. The kind of silence that follows violence the way a shadow follows a body. Caleb knew Vance would come. He had known since the courtroom, since the moment the territorial marshal put irons on the man who signed Vance's pay. A dog whose master goes to prison does not lie down. It bites the nearest hand. What Caleb had not calculated, what he should have seen and did not, was that Vance would not come for him. Vance would come for Frank. The logic was military. Vance's logic always was: strike the target your enemy values most, but guards least. Caleb had been in the courtroom. His ranch hands had been scattered between town and the Moore property. Frank Dalton was alone at the Rowan Ranch, checking on stock, unaware that the hearing had ended and the world had shifted. Vance appeared at the horse barn without announcement. Frank was inside, grooming the bay gelding Caleb favored, his back to the open door, humming a tune he had learned in prison. The first bullet hit him below the ribs on the left side. He went down against the stall door, sending the horse into a panic that probably saved his life because the gelding's rearing body blocked Vance's second shot. 2 ranch hands in the bunkhouse heard the gunfire and responded. One fired from the bunkhouse window, missing Vance but driving him behind the stone water trough. The other reached Frank and dragged him deeper into the barn. Caleb rode hard from town. The distance between Copper Bend and the ranch was 9 miles, and he covered it at a speed that risked his horse's legs on frozen ground. He arrived to find the standoff. Vance behind the water trough, disciplined and patient, exchanging occasional fire with hands who could not approach without crossing open ground. Frank bleeding on the barn floor with a ranch hand pressing wadded cloth against the wound. Caleb dismounted out of sight behind the main house. He did not charge. He did not shout. He moved through the connected outbuildings the way the army had taught him, quiet and deliberate, using cover and angles. Snow muffled his boots. Wind covered the small sounds of movement. He worked around to the feed shed that sat 30 feet from Vance's position and approached from the angle Vance was not covering, close enough to speak without shouting. "Hector." Vance's head turned. Two men who had once fought side by side, now on opposite ends of a gun barrel. The recognition on Vance's face was immediate and complex. Not surprise. Something more like bitter confirmation. Rowan. You should have stayed out of this. Probably. You should have picked a different line of work after the army. Vance's laugh was short and humorless. We do not all get to become respectable ranchers, Caleb. Some of us stayed what we always were. His voice carried an old wound. You pretend you are clean now. I was at Powder River with you. I remember what you were. You are not different from me. I know I am not. Caleb's voice was steady. That is exactly why I am standing here. The exchange was brief and brutal. Vance moved first, swinging his weapon toward Caleb's voice. Caleb fired from a braced position against the feed shed wall. The bullet hit Vance's gun arm. The revolver spun into the snow. Vance did not scream. He cursed once, grabbed his bleeding arm, and ran. Through the corral, over the fence, toward a horse tied beyond the tree line. Caleb had a clean second shot, a clear line on a retreating figure against white snow. He did not take it. He turned and ran to Frank instead. Frank lay on the barn floor in a spreading pool of red that steamed against the cold air. His face was gray, his breathing shallow. Caleb dropped to his knees and pressed both hands against the wound. Stay with me, Frank. You did not survive 2 years in territorial prison to die in my horse barn. Frank's eyes focused with effort. Did you get him? Wounded him. He ran. Should have finished it. Probably. Eliza arrived 40 minutes later. She had ridden from town alone through the darkness, across miles of frozen prairie, without escort or permission. She heard the shots the same way Caleb had heard them, and she rode toward the sound the same way he had ridden through the blizzard 3 weeks earlier. The same courage. The same refusal to stand aside while someone she cared about was in danger. She found Frank on the barn floor with Caleb's hands red with his best friend's blood. She did not hesitate. She took over wound management with the calm efficiency of a woman who had treated injuries her whole life, her steady hands and clear instructions organizing the chaos into effective emergency care. Ruth arrived behind her on the second horse. Eliza sent her to boil water and tear bandages and dispatched 2 ranch hands after Vance with specific descriptions and directions. Frank stabilized. Not safe, but alive. They loaded him into the wagon and sent him toward town with an armed escort and instructions to bring Doc Henderson regardless of the man's debts. Because even a compromised doctor was better than no doctor at all. Hours later, the ranch house quiet in the way that only follows violence. Ruth asleep in a chair by the fire, exhausted from a day that had contained a courtroom hearing, a 9-mile ride, and emergency surgery in a horse barn. The ranch hands posted at watch around the property. Caleb and Eliza sat on the front porch, both covered in blood and snowmelt. The cold was brutal, but neither moved inside. The sky had cleared, and stars were appearing through the torn remnants of clouds. I do not deserve you, Caleb said. A long silence. That is not your decision to make, Eliza replied. Another silence. Longer. Gerard was right about everything. I drew the maps. Your father's orchard was on my list. I quit before I finished that particular job, but quitting does not erase the doing, and I knew Gerard continued after I left, and I did not stop him. I know. I had already figured out most of it before he said it in court. Hearing it there just made it real in a different way. She paused. You should have told me yourself. Yes. Why did you not? Because telling you meant losing you. And you are the first person in 15 years who has made that empty house feel like it could be a home. Caleb's voice cracked on the last word, the first time Eliza had heard anything other than absolute control in his speech. Selfish reason. I know. Eliza turned to face him. She studied his profile in the starlight, the lines around his eyes, the silver at his temples, the jaw that he kept clenched against the pain in his burned shoulders. A man carrying 15 years of guilt and still showing up when it mattered. I spent my whole life being told what I could and could not have, she said. By poverty, by society, by Adelaide Thornton, by circumstances. I am not going to let your guilt make that decision for me, too. She reached out. Her hands, the calloused, scarred working hands that had been mocked in a mercantile and had pulled a man from a burning building and had held a wounded friend's life together with pressure and clean linen, gripped the front of Caleb's coat. She kissed him. She initiated. She chose. She reached for him with full knowledge of what he had done and full agency over what she wanted. And what she wanted was this complicated, guilty, honest man who had spent 15 years trying to become someone worthy of a moment exactly like this one. When they pulled apart, her forehead rested against his. I do not forgive your past, she said. Her breath was warm against his cold skin. But I am choosing your future. Is there a difference? Caleb closed his eyes. 15 years of guilt, and all of it came down to this. A woman with calloused hands and clear eyes choosing him despite knowing the worst thing he had ever done. There is enough of one, he said, and for the first time in 15 years, he believed it. 6 months after the hearing, Eliza Moore stood inside Porter's Mercantile, the same spot where everything began, and bought a spool of white thread. Thomas Porter smiled when he handed it to her. The store felt different now, lighter somehow, as if cruelty had been a weight pressing on the walls, and its absence let the building breathe. The territory had changed in those 6 months. Gerard Thornton was convicted by the territorial court on charges of banking fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 12 years at the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie. His assets were seized and placed under receivership. The bank was reorganized under new management, and every foreclosure Gerard had engineered was reviewed. 3 families whose land had been stolen through his schemes received compensation from the seized assets. It was not full justice. You cannot return years of lost labor and stolen futures, but it was something. Hector Vance was captured 3 days after the ranch attack by a territorial marshal's posse. They found him half frozen in an abandoned line shack, his bullet wound gone septic, too weak to run. He was tried and convicted of assault with intent to kill, arson, and cattle theft conspiracy, and sentenced to 8 years at the territorial prison. During the trial, Caleb was called to testify. He confirmed their shared military service. When the prosecutor asked if he had anything to say about the defendant's character, Caleb paused for a long time before answering. Hector Vance was a good soldier. The territory that made him one failed to give him anything else to be. It was not forgiveness. It was the recognition that broken systems create broken men, and that blame, properly distributed, rarely lands on a single pair of shoulders. Adelaide Thornton divorced Gerard while he awaited sentencing. She used her portion of legitimately held assets to open a dressmaking shop on Main Street, the first time in her 42 years that she had worked for a living with her own hands. The shop was small and the early months were lean, but Adelaide discovered something she had never known about herself. She was good with fabric and needle and thread. She had an eye for what suited people, and that eye, previously used to judge and diminish, turned out to be equally useful for making women feel beautiful. She and Eliza did not become friends. They nodded to each other on the street with the genuine respect of 2 women who had fought on the same side once, and did not need to pretend it had made them sisters. Frank Dalton recovered slowly. The gut wound left him with a permanent limp and a scar that pulled when the weather changed. He complained about both with the cheerful profanity of a man who had looked at death and been released on a technicality. Caleb promoted him to full partner in ranch operations. Not a gift, but the recognition of what Frank had always been. Took you getting a woman to figure that out, boss, Frank observed dryly. Ruth Moore did not get sent away to school. She chose it. After the fire, after her investigation had nearly cracked the case against Gerard, after she had ridden through darkness to help save a man's life in a horse barn, Ruth sat down with Eliza on the porch of the Orchard farmhouse and said what she had been carrying for months. I love this orchard. But I am not meant to spend my life in it. I want to study law, like Clara Briggs. Eliza's first instinct was to hold on, to explain all the reasons Ruth needed to stay, all the ways the orchard needed her, all the practical arguments against a 17-year-old girl riding off to Cheyenne to pursue a profession that barely existed for women. Instead, she let go. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than facing Adelaide in the Mercantile, harder than walking into a burning building, harder than kissing a man whose past could break her heart. She let go of Ruth the way you let go of a branch in spring, not because you want to lose the blossom, but because holding on would prevent the fruit. The Moore orchard needed new hands after Ruth's departure. Caleb invested in a modern irrigation system and hired a young couple, the Hendersons, former homesteaders who had been among the families displaced by Gerard's earlier schemes. They worked the land under Eliza's continued oversight, and the orchard did not just survive. It produced its best harvest in a decade. The Moore name stayed on the gate. The wedding was in April. The orchard was in full bloom. White and pink blossoms drifting like warm snow, carried on a breeze that smelled of honey and new growth. Simple ceremony at the Methodist Church. Reverend Michaels presiding with the sincere warmth of a man who had watched this particular story unfold from his front pew, and who believed genuinely that grace sometimes arrived in dusty boots. Eliza wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had bought with her own money. Profits from the first successful harvest under her management. Not a gift from Caleb, not charity fabric. Cotton she had earned and cut and stitched with her own calloused hands. She walked into this marriage standing on ground she had built herself. Caleb wore his best suit with a vest that Eliza had embroidered in the weeks before the wedding. Her stitch work on his chest, over his heart. Reciprocity. After the ceremony, at the kitchen table in the ranch house that now had curtains and rugs and shelves full of books and the smell of bread baking, Caleb presented the partnership papers. 50-50 ownership of the Rowan Ranch operation. Equal voice, equal stake, equal authority. Eliza read them carefully. More women read every document twice. Then she picked up the pen and added a clause in her own handwriting at the bottom of the last page. 10% of annual ranch profits would fund a trust for homestead families displaced by fraudulent foreclosure in the territory. She pushed the papers across the table. This is how you make it right, Caleb. Not with guilt, not with anonymous payments that let you punish yourself in private where nobody can see. With money that has your name on it going to people who deserve it, out in the open where it counts. Atonement is not something you do in the dark. Caleb read the clause. His jaw worked. He picked up the pen and signed without a single word of hesitation. Earlier that week, when Eliza had returned to Porter's Mercantile for her thread, something happened that she would remember for the rest of her life. She was paying Thomas Porter when the door opened. A young woman stepped in, dusty from the road, wearing a dress that had been mended twice with stitching that was careful but visible. She carried a baby on one hip and uncertainty in every line of her body. Her eyes moved around the store the way prey animals scan for predators, looking for the thing that would hurt her before it had a chance to strike. Two women near the fabric bolts glanced at the stranger, then at each other. They did not say anything cruel. The territory had learned that particular lesson. But the silent assessment was there. The measuring. The weighing of worth by appearance. The ancient arithmetic of who belongs and who does not. Eliza set down her change on the counter, walked across the store, extended her hand, the calloused, scarred working hand that Adelaide Thornton had mocked in this very room, and spoke loud enough for every person present to hear. I am Eliza Rowan. You are new to Copper Bend? Let me introduce you to some people. The young woman's face changed. The wariness did not disappear, because wariness born of hard experience does not vanish with a handshake. But something in her eyes shifted. The recognition of being seen, of being welcomed instead of weighed. Eliza did not need Caleb for this, did not need anyone to speak for her or stand beside her. She had become what he had been for her in this very store months ago, but in her own way. Not through power or wealth or the implied threat of economic consequence, through the simple, deliberate act of extending dignity to a stranger. She glanced back toward the hardware section. Caleb was standing there, the same spot he had occupied the day they met. Wire cutters in his hand, just like before. His eyes met hers across the store. He did not speak, just nodded once, the same small nod she had given him outside the church months ago when their story was just beginning. The circle closed. That evening, late, after the supper dishes were washed and the ranch hands had returned to the bunkhouse, and the territory settled into the deep quiet of a spring night, Eliza heard a sound from the new storehouse, the one that had been rebuilt on the ashes of the old one, with lumber Frank's crew had hauled and raised in a single long Saturday of communal labor. Her heart kicked. Old instincts. The memory of kerosene and flame, and her sister pinned beneath a fallen beam. She took the lamp from the kitchen table and walked out into the April darkness. The air was cool and fragrant. Apple blossoms from the orchard drifted on the breeze, even from miles away. Their sweetness mixed with the smell of new timber and hay and the particular freshness of a world renewing itself after a hard winter. Inside the storehouse, she found the source of the sound. Not a bullet, not a threat. A barn cat, one of the ranch's half-wild Mausers, curled in a corner of the hay and nursing a litter of kittens. 5 of them, eyes still closed, pressing against their mother with the blind urgency of new life. Eliza set the lamp down on a hay bale and sat on the storehouse floor. She watched the kittens nurse, felt the cool wood beneath her, smelled hay and new timber and apple blossoms. And for the first time in the entire story, for the first time since her father died with a foreclosure letter in his hand, since Adelaide's cruelty in the mercantile, since the fire in the courtroom and blood on snow, Eliza Moore Rowan cried. Not from grief, not from relief exactly. From the specific overwhelming experience of arriving somewhere she had not known she was traveling to. The tears came quietly, the way spring rain comes after a long drought. Not dramatic, just necessary. Footsteps behind her. Caleb. He stood in the doorway and saw her sitting on the floor with tears on her face and kittens in the hay. He read the whole scene in a single glance, the way he read land and weather and the complicated terrain of a woman he loved. He did not ask what was wrong, did not offer comfort or solutions or the kind of words that filled silence without actually saying anything. He sat down beside her on the storehouse floor. Their shoulders touched. His hand found hers in the lamplight, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. And he stayed. Just stayed. Outside, the April night continued its quiet work. Stars turned overhead. Somewhere in the distance, cattle settled for sleep. The apple trees in the Moore orchard miles away, but connected to this place by history and love, and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to let good things die, opened their blossoms to the darkness and waited for morning. Dignity was not something given or recognized or declared in a courtroom. Dignity was something Eliza had carried every day of her life. Before anyone saw it, before the bullet and the fire and the hearing, before a tall man in a dusty store spoke words that changed everything and nothing at all. Caleb Rowan did not give her dignity. He was simply the first person brave enough to say out loud what she had always known. But Eliza Moore Rowan, was the one who walked through fire to keep it.